Hello, my friends. It is Sunday, March 30th, 2025, and things are not necessarily what they seem. I'll explain what I mean by that. First, my name is Gerdes. I'm just a professor trying to provide context in the war in Ukraine. We're going to start with this. This is an image of what's going on in Turkey. Massive protests. But what's causing it? Well, it appears that Erdogan, who's the president, who's not a really good guy. He's kind of tight with the Islamic Brotherhood, and he's kind of a dictator, kind of like Putin, but a little downscale. He has arrested his opposition for the upcoming election. So Turkish opposition launches a petition for early presidential elections. Mass protests continue in Turkey in support of the arrested mayor of Istanbul, who is the competition. And there's something like 2 million people who joined the demonstration. Now, Turkey is a pivotal place. It's a country that will be needed perhaps more than ever as the U.S. kind of creates a vacuum moving away from NATO. Turkey really could be kind of a counterweight over in the area. And now he can be chummy with Putin. That's true. He can, soak up Russian oil or that sort of thing. But he can also support Crimea as being Ukrainian. So that's where we are with it. It's just not clean and cut. So that's the first big story. Second big story is this. So leaked interrogation transcripts have revealed that the Kremlin has secretly taken over dozens of popular Russian Telegram channels, de-anonymizing, that is, making the names public of their administrators on Putin's direct orders and persuading them physically, violently perhaps, to hand control to the Russian presidential administration. Now, I saw this and then I looked at the actual article. It had to be translated. It's Russian crime. Truth loves to act openly. And I read through the article. And when I read through the article, I said, oh, okay, well, these highlights were really good by Chris Owicki. So the guy, his name is Polyakov. He reportedly told interrogators that he had forced administrators of dozens of anonymously run Telegram channels to hand over control to the Russian presidential authority. And they did this kind of through violent means if necessary, or just turning pressure on them. And so there's a number of these that, and so they're posting now these articles that are in line with what the Kremlin actually wants as their narratives. And so that it's making like state media and the Russian Z bloggers more in alignment. I used to say that if you wanted to know what was true, listen to the Z blogger, not because his perspective, he wants Russia to win, not because of that, but simply because that Z blogger is more truthful than Russian state media. Okay, we'll see how that all plays out. So next big story, third big story, U.S. intelligence overheard a conversation in October of 2022 where Russian General Surovikin was ready to use nukes to stop Ukraine from crossing the Dnipro in order to enter Crimea. And he was openly talking about using nukes, and it was intercepted. Now, was it intercepted because they meant it to, or because it was just intercepted? Now, Joe Biden had been freaked out from about that point forward about not appeasing not angering Putin by appeasing rather than, making sure they didn't cross some red line and being very, very overly cautious. And this might have been the fount of that. Big story number 4. So Trump played golf with the president of Finland and now plans to buy icebreakers from Finland. Okay, well, it makes sense. Finland and icebreakers. Okay, the U.S. president praised Alexander Stubb's game and said Finnish icebreakers are exactly what America needs. Remember, he keeps talking about the Arctic and Greenland and the Arctic Circle and that sort of thing. Stubb also shared positive message on social media, saying he discussed foreign policy with Trump during the visit, including Ukraine. For context, Stubb has long been a strong supporter of Ukrainians in their fight against the aggressor. So I'm pretty sure that he's going to give Trump the message, not necessarily that Trump wants to hear, but that needs to be communicated. And so that on balance is a good thing. And buying icebreakers from Finland will probably be good for Finland. And so there we are. Okay, next big story number 5. So there's a secret Pentagon document that was just released, and deterring Russia is no longer American top foreign policy. Now, there's a reason for that. It's not because, we're just giving it over to the Russians. U.S. doctrine actually says we have the military that can fight anywhere in the world, one front. Not two fronts, not three fronts. We just don't have an army that's that size. After the fall of the Soviet Union, we rearranged our army, fighting smaller terrorist kind of things around the world or engaged in small-scale activities, maybe special forces kind of things. But we can fight one conventional war in one place, and it looks like the place that they are most worried about is Taiwan. Now, Britt Hume was talking about that, replying to Clifford May said, if Putin wins his imperialist war, his buddies in Beijing, Tehran, and Pyongyang will conclude that Trump, like the two American presidents who preceded him, can be counted on to go wobbly sooner or later. And Britt Hume, I'm highlighting this because Britt Hume is a chief political analyst at Fox News, says that's what has worried me about Ukraine war from the start. There are folks like Britt Hume at Fox that are like me that are going, you know what, you gotta stand strong on Ukraine. That makes it more likely that she doesn't get antsy. Okay, so that's what's going on here. Okay, now here's what the doctrine actually says. The internal guidance memo from Pete Hegseth focuses on deterring China's seizure of Taiwan and shoring up homeland defense. That's according to the Washington Post. Now, that makes me kind of happy and kind of like, you should have been doing this with Ukraine, but it's kind of happy because they're not sending mixed signals to Xi. Okay, China has been declared the only main threat for the U.S. Should be Russia as well, but just hear what's happening. The main task is to prevent the capture of Taiwan by China. This is considered the key scenario under which the entire U.S. defense architecture will be built. So they're shifting from the Army to the Navy for that reason. Like talking about rebuilding ships, and they better be paying attention to what's going on with drones. All other threats, Russia, Iran, the People's Republic of China, the Democratic People's Republic of China, North Korea. That's North Korea is what I was talking about. All of it is secondary. Okay. NATO must take on much greater responsibility since the U.S. will not be able to simultaneously confront China and support Europe. This is American military doctrine, and this is part of the shift. It's not as much about, I know some people will say, well, it's just about Trump just loves Putin and he's giving stuff over. He might love Putin, but it's also been, and this was before Trump, that military doctrine has shifted over to focusing on China. NATO must take on much greater responsibility since the U.S. will not be able to simultaneously confront China and support Europe. The document directly states that in the event of Russian military aggression, Europe should contain it independently. The U.S. can only provide those forces that are not involved in defending homeland or deterring China. The U.S. will support nuclear deterrence against Russia, but will not provide significant conventional forces. And I think the U.S. has made that kind of clear. The defense of Taiwan is the only scenario model according to which a major war is planned. This is what they're worried about. And I've had people in the know in the military tell me that, yeah, we're probably going to be at war with China in 2 years unless something changes, unless something goes off course. That's what it looks like at this point. Okay, next big story, Financial Times. The Trump administration has sent a letter to some large companies in the EU warning them to comply with an executive order banning diversity, equity, and inclusion programs. Now, during the Biden administration, many of these went into play, particularly in the military. In the Trump administration, they're unwinding what the Biden administration did. Are they anti-diversity or something? I don't think that that's it. But the DEI programs are something different than what we've traditionally thought of as diversity programs. And so, for example, we're talking about equity, meaning that if there is a gap between any two groups, then there is an inherent discrimination assumed. And that's the kind of thing that the Trump administration is pushing back on. This is just giving some background. This is how I would explain it in class. Okay, companies that are potentially exposed to the U.S. demands include aviation and defense groups, consulting providers, and infrastructure companies. The letters were written by U.S. Embassy personnel in France, Belgium, and the countries of Eastern Europe. The letter was accompanied by a questionnaire to assess compliance with U.S. government requirements in this area. A senior banker in Paris said that he was shocked by the letter. It's crazy, but everything is now possible. The rule of the strongest now prevails. Okay, let's take a step back. I don't know that it's the rule the strongest necessarily. It's just that the presidential administration that's in power is putting in different rules than the president administration before that, and that kind of generally happens. I mean, this is what happened between the Biden administration and the previous Trump administration, just in the different direction. But what's different here is that it's affecting those companies that do business with the U.S. government. It would be, and I'm not saying that the DEI thing is the same as like child labor, but it would be like the same as saying, like, you can't, if you do this child labor practice, you can't do business with the U.S. government. They're saying the same kind of thing here effectively, and that's going to be potentially problematic for some of these countries. And it's having an impact outside the U.S. in these other countries. Okay, so Trump, now next big story, Trump warned he would impose 25 to 50% tariff on Russian oil if Moscow hinders his efforts to end the Ukraine war. And you're thinking, well, that's good. Okay, so it's not all that it seems. Yes, that would be good, but a tariff is not the same as sanctions. It would be better if it was like secondary sanctions on these companies, kind of like what we were just talking about here, like that. This is almost like a secondary sanctions kind of thing. Like, you can't play with us if you're doing this. That's what you need with these companies that are dealing with Russian oil. Now, here, this is the article, ironically, in Radio Free Europe talking about it. The U.S. President Donald Trump said that he will impose secondary tariffs of 25 to 50% on all Russian oil if he feels Moscow is blocking his efforts to end the war in Ukraine. But we already don't get the Ukrainian or the Russian oil, so it doesn't really matter a whole lot. But let's see how that all plays out. During a March 30 phone interview with NBC News, U.S. President Donald Trump said that he was very angry and pissed off when Russian President Vladimir Putin called for a transitional government to be put in place in Ukraine, which could effectively push out Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky. Here's what he actually had to say. Here it is on NBC News.
Just hours ago, President Trump called me to tell me he is, quote, pissed off with Russia's President Putin and threatened to impose secondary tariffs on Russia's oil. Quote, if Russia and I are unable to make a deal on stopping the bloodshed in Ukraine, and if I think it was Russia's fault, which it might not be, but if I think it was Russia's fault, I am going to put secondary tariffs on all oil coming out of Russia. Mr. Trump said 25% tariffs on Russian oil could happen any moment and told me he plans to speak with President Putin this week. The president told me, quote, I was very angry, pissed off when Putin started getting into Zelensky's credibility and started talking about new leadership in Ukraine.
Okay, but why? Because it's Trump that wants this ceasefire because he's the great deal maker far more than Putin, who actually wants the land. And so nothing's really going to happen there with a ceasefire in my estimation, but okay. Okay, let's take a deep breath and just, before we read this article, okay, so this was in a Daily Mail, and it said revealed, this is an exclusive, revealed how Trump could be president until 2037 due to a simple loophole in the Constitution. Okay, in my estimation, this is nothing, and I'm explaining why I think it's nothing first with some credibility. I did my doctoral dissertation on the U.S. Constitution. Now, the 22nd Amendment has nothing to do with where I am, but I understand the system and the way the Founding Fathers thought and what was going on. And they would have thought you could keep running as long as you are being elected. And then we came along to Franklin Delano Roosevelt. He had 4 terms. He was in his 4th term when he died. And the American government thought, let's add an amendment, not more than 2 terms. It had been only 2 terms up to that point. Washington set the example. Okay. So as I went into the article itself, here's what it had to say. All right, here it is. No person, this is the text of this 22nd Amendment to the United States Constitution says, no person shall be elected, look at the language, elected to the office of the president more than twice, and no person who has held the office of president or acted as president for more than 2 years of a term to which some other person was elected president shall be elected to the office of the president more than once. Okay. So the plain reading of that is actually you can't serve more than 2 terms. But if you focus just on the word elected, you see a loophole. So in 1999, there was a Minnesota Law Review article co-authored by Professor Bruce Peabody, who, this is a very minority view that is not accepted by the courts necessarily, entitled "The Twice and Future President." It outlines how the amendment has been subjected to widespread misunderstanding and concludes that the idea of a twice-elected president is constitutionally prohibited from serving again is decidedly incorrect, says this law professor. I mean, anybody can make this argument. According to the paper, we contend that the 22nd Amendment prescribes only the re-election of an already twice elected president. But if he wasn't reelected, if something happened to if he was the vice president, something happened to the president, he could become president again. Okay, it's pretty fanciful, but this is where he is. Trump, therefore, could run for vice president with Vance as an openly recognized nominal figure at the top of the ticket. First, you'd have to have a vice president willing to do that. And would he do that in order to actually help him get in like that? I'm not sure. Once he's sworn in, Vance could then resign, allowing his vice president, Trump, to step into the office. So Vance goes off into the desert, I guess, and nowhere, and he's resigned. He's not going to just become vice president. The same procedure could be used in multiple elections. To win a fourth term, Trump would simply have to resign the presidency before the 2032 election and become the running mate of a nominal presidential candidate and Vance or someone else. Okay. If you're wound up about this thing, you shouldn't be. And if you're listening to people that are wound up about this, they shouldn't be. I mean, it's just that simple. The Supreme Court opponents could challenge such a move in the courts, arguing that it breaches the 22nd Amendment, but Professor Peabody told DailyMail.com, and why the Daily Mail is even publishing this, except that it's going to get eyeballs, and we're in the attention economy. That's it. It would be pretty hard for the Supreme Court to undo. That would be especially so given the conservative makeup of the current court and its bent toward textualist interpretation of the Constitution. Okay, stop. The conservatives on the court, when you think of conservatives on the court, you think, oh, the Republicans have the court and the House and the Senate and the presidency. No, they have the House, they have the Senate, and they have the presidency. The conservatives on the court are originalists. They're not voting in a Republican way. They're trying to see what the original meaning of the text is. Now, they talk about textualists here. The textualists are concerned primarily with the plain or popular meaning of the text of the Constitution. Originalists are actually trying to make sure that what it said is what we're actually doing, not that we're reading something modern into it. And so I have zero, I'd be willing to bet very large amounts of money that nothing will happen here, even though Trump said something about how, he would, I could go for another term or something like that. Of course you could. And the reason that he says these kinds of things is because it's good for the news cycle, puts him back in the news, and is willing to say it, but nothing will happen with this. So if anybody is making you worried about it, please don't be worried about that. Okay, I told you a lot of things don't appear to be what they are. And just like this meme, nothing starts with an N and ends with a G. Change my mind. All right, that's all. That's a lot. Thank you for your time. Thank you for the likes, the shares, and the subscribes. And thank you for being the kind of person that cares about Ukraine.